Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of 365 Explained. My name's Zach, and I'm here with Ben.
Alrighty.
And today we are going to be talking around the M365 update lifecycle.
Yeah, it's one of those topics that I feel we're doing quite a bit recently, where we end up explaining something that is very convoluted and complicated, and then getting to an answer that ends up being, well, it depends, really.
Yeah, that classic consulted answer of it depends. Yeah, for sure.
So it's okay. I think we've got some interesting ground to cover. I've certainly learned quite a lot doing my research for this.
Yeah,
There's some stuff I didn't know existed, so that's always fun.
yeah. And I mean, in every single one of these podcast episodes, I seem to come out of it learning an awful lot more than when we went in, and stuff I probably already should have known. But that's one of the great reasons that we've got this. Yeah. I mean, maybe Ben, if you just start with a little bit about what we're going to cover today, and then we can kind of just jump into to start talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this being 365 explained, the goal is to look at updating across the 365 ecosystem. This is something that is becoming not more of a challenge. The management of this is becoming more of a challenge to organizations because we're in a very high rate of change era at the moment. You know, as we talked about on our Frontier episode with Copilot, Frontier is a preview program for Copilot's features and functionality. It is Microsoft needed a way of releasing new features across their stack with Copilot very, very quickly, hence the Frontier program. The idea behind this was to dig into kind of the M365 services as a whole. And we both come from an era where there was a lot of on-premises deployments of Exchange, of SharePoint, of Skype for Business, Link, all that fun stuff. Where the updating process was very well defined. It was you would deploy Exchange Server 2025, 2007, whatever it is. 2025, this would have been last year's. You know what I mean? The Exchange 2007, you knew where you were. There were then monthly security updates to that product. There were then particular cumulative updates or service packs or feature releases, depending on the product and the particular era that you were looking at. And you would schedule that downtime in, you would schedule that maintenance, you would understand what the change was, how it was supposed to work. You would need to modify your servers, your infrastructure, whatever it is. And you had the plus side of the stability of knowing what you were doing because you were doing it. But you had the downside of you needed to plan that maintenance, you needed to schedule it, you needed to be responsible for that service. The utopia, the thing we were promised with M365 is it is an online service. So it's that phrase evergreen, isn't it? If you're familiar with the phrase, right? That you don't have to be messing on with the servers and the services, but you lose some of that control around understanding exactly what has changed or the timeline against something was changed. I'm sure that's a pain you've felt with your customers as well, I'd imagine.
Oh, well, yeah, 100%. And that, you know, moving to a cloud service that always on, kind of service, um, knowing as well what is updated when in that cloud service. Like you correctly said, with on-prem infrastructure, you had a lot more control. You could choose exactly when that happened or if
Yeah.
it happened. Whereas now there is more cycles, and it's going to happen at some point. Things are going to get updated. You're not going to be able to say no to them all. But
Yeah.
understanding where they are and how to control them is key.
And I guess we should probably add as well that some of what we're talking about here is based on actual Microsoft Docs in Learn and controls and things that you can see, but some of it is mildly extrapolated because it has to be. Microsoft doesn't publish the exact information about how they have a cadence of release strategies across their cloud, right? Because that's the other dimension to this. You see a feature in a blog post, you might be in the right channel, ring, preview flag, whatever it is, but it still doesn't mean that it shows up for your tenants, because your tenants could be on a, Europe East, or, whatever where your service is coming out of, and that's actually been deployed over in the US, and, is working its way through APAC before it comes to your environment. It's one of those massive things I'd be really interested to learn more about, of how this is actually operating at the scale that Microsoft has to operate it at. So, we as the admins are stuck with kind of doing our best to make sure we have the right process and procedures and settings configured our environment, but you're still at the mercy of something else that you don't understand. I think we've joked about with Teams in particular in the past. You kind of almost want to have some sort of a dashboard, so that you can, across multiple tenants and environments, see something rippling out, so you can then understand when it's going to be in front of your users, because that's ultimately what this is about, right? Is the end user experience, making sure that the users have access to the tools and the features that will help them do their jobs in a controlled and manageable fashion.
Yeah, and I can only imagine what it's like for people administrating end users. Even in MVP chats and conversations, there's always a wait. Have you got that feature yet? Wait, have you got that? Wait, why have I not got it? And you're still
Yeah.
asking. This is in Teams. You're asking those questions, and why have I not got it yet? And do I need to
Yeah,
turn something else on?
well, that's it. It's like, have they turned something on that you don't? Are they in a data center that you're not? Have you turned something off that they haven't? So it's which combination of those things is causing the issue.
Yeah.
So I think an interesting place to start is going to be talking about the broad M365 services, and then there's some kind of little side quests we can go on. But by that we mean Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, but Teams is again a little nuanced. Um, but Microsoft has talked in the past about, and some of this terminology is maybe slightly outdated, but it helps in my mental model of this notion of rings, where you have kind of like the skin on an onion, like an inside ring, and then an outer layer and an outer layer and an outer layer. So when Microsoft is developing and adding new functionality, it goes into the inside layer and then pushes out from there as it goes through various quality and gating checks. So there's a Learn Docs page that sort of shows this progression, where when a feature team, a dev team inside Microsoft write something, they are on a very specific ring that has access to that feature that they have written, so they can test it, they can do whatever validations they need to do. Then it will push out to the broader M365 development teams. So even if you're a SharePoint developer, you will have kind of preview functionality or super early preview functionality of something in Exchange available to you. Then it pushes out to Microsoft broader, which is where there's this term of dog fooding that I was amazed you had never heard. But what is dog fooding, Zach?
So it's basically using your own products and services internally. So this is when Microsoft's own employees are being able to use these new features that have been released.
There we go. Eating your own dog food because it's that tasty that you're gonna use it yourself.
Yep.
And then you have the kind of releases, which is the proper name for them now, that are end user facing. And as a M365 consumer, in as an admin in your tenant, you should be able to find settings for a targeted release and a standard release. So targeted release is effectively a early public preview, and a standard release is you're in the mix with all of the general things, right? And then I guess this is muddled by TAP. You're aware what TAP is, right?
Yep.
So
Yeah.
TAP is the technology adoption program that, again, we used to have with on-prem versions of software, where you would be under NDA. You still are if you're part of TAP, but you would have early releases of ISOs and other stuff. Um, TAP is kind of mixed in depending on what service you're dealing with, but they are kind of post the M365 team and pre general Microsoft getting access to things. I think that would be where I would sort of slot it, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And those targeted release and standard release, that's when it's hitting customers, right? Or before that. It's all internal
Yeah, so
Microsoft.
it
Yeah,
should be, or you're like engaged formally in a preview program like Tap.
yeah,
And in your tenant, you can go and have a look at your settings for kind of the broadest catch-all of these things. That if you go into admin.cloud.microsoft, and down the left-hand side under settings, make sure you've hit the show all settings button, otherwise it will probably be hidden. And then into org settings, you've got kind of three tabs across the top for services, security, and then organizational profile. Under organizational profile, there should be a release preferences slide out, and you've got three choices in there, which is everybody in the organization is on standard release, everybody in the organization is on targeted release, or in the UI here is mildly frustrating. You have to say, I'm going to do selected users for targeted release, hit save, and then you have the option to pick the users or upload a CSV file containing the user accounts that you want to put on the targeted release. So kind of on the slightly more forward, earlier preview for the M365 services.
interestingly as well, it seemed that, especially in your tenant, you were set to target release for everyone. So this is your entire organization gets updates early.
Yeah.
Uh, do we kind of know if that's default? Is everyone that's spinning up an Office 365 tenant also going to be getting updates early? So maybe that more change management. If you don't want to be getting those things early, you want to be a little bit more conservative. Maybe this is a something you come and do first. Make sure you're on that
Yeah.
standard release.
Well, it's that because it's such a broad brush setting. It's make sure you know what you're on. The default would be standard release for everybody, but it might be that at some point in the past there was a particular feature that somebody was desperate to get in the tenant, and so that got ticked or swapped or changed. So come and have a look. Like this is my preview personal tenant, so I'm on targeted release for everybody, but I would suggest that the default in here should be that you're on targeted for selected users, and then you have not just IT, but you have IT and some friendlies on kind of targeted release, and make sure they know they're on targeted release, because that's where you get the classic, oh, hey, have you seen this new thing I can do in Outlook, and it's not there for anybody else in their team, which is a challenge, right?
Yeah, definitely. So we've kind of covered talking about some of the cloud services. What about things like the actual desktop apps themselves? So Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, those kind of client side applications. Where would we
Yeah,
look for those?
and it's a good point. And I guess just one last thing on the cloud services side of that. Still, I touched on it before, but it is an important point. That thing of when you have put yourself into targeted release and something is released, there still will be a lag before you see that in your environment, because that is it deploying around all of those data centers, in the world and being switched on. Microsoft must be doing some sort of crazy analytics at scale to look for any anomalies or any issues with these things rippling out, so that they can pause, they can stop it. We all know, was it CrowdStrike a couple of years ago had their like mega issue where some patch release kind of got pushed out in a accidentally across everything and broke stuff. That is what these companies are trying really hard to avoid doing. But that's then your point kind of comes in of like, it might have pushed out to my tenant, I might have been in the right preview ring, but I still don't see it yet. That's because if you're interacting with stuff through the desktop app, maybe your desktop app doesn't have whatever the corresponding feature flag is, or bit of code to show you whatever that new preview is. So we've got this weird mix of, and then this is why Microsoft has got the new Outlook app, right? Because the new Outlook app is a re-architecting of classic Outlook. Classic Outlook was very functional, very good application, solid, but it was very bloated and very hard for them to add new stuff to. Like if you look at how long it took them to be able to add a Copilot pop-out side window, into classic Outlook, it took a long time. Whereas modern Outlook, new Outlook, whatever it's called this week, um, that is basically the PWA style app. It's like the same as the Exchange online web services. Um, so that means you will see stuff in there. So if you are running Office on your desktop, you have to consider how you access functionality inside the desktop apps, and they have their own kind of updating process. They have update channels. The correct terminology is channels there. You have a current channel, you have a monthly enterprise channel, and you have a semi-annual enterprise channel. Now, the interesting thing that I found out I hadn't realized while I was researching this is kind of, I think if you went back a year or 18 months, the guidance was that the semi-annual enterprise channel was supposed to be the slightly more solid ground, the fixed release schedule, they only updated twice a year. And that was kind of more where I would have seen organizations for their broad suite of users, whereas now specifically Microsoft recommends that that is only used for unattended and automated workstations or devices. So stuff where you are running something where an end user isn't interactively logging in and doing something on the machine. And I think that's because we will otherwise, you will start to see this issue of there is functionality in the cloud, but the software doesn't match the capability in the cloud, so that functionality isn't there for the user. And it's also why things like, back on the Copilot Frontier, when you were wanting to do stuff with the Excel agent, originally you had to go to Excel on the web to be able to get the agent functionality for Copilot to show up, because the desktop version was not, was not kind of pulling and being in line. So the equivalent of our two channels of targeted release and normal channel, we have an equivalent inside the Office apps, which is the monthly enterprise and the current. So monthly enterprise is the slightly slower version, and current is the you know, mainstream, if you like. But then the preview version is if you're part of the M365 Insider preview program, I think it's called. There is a beta channel and there is a current channel preview. And the current channel preview is about a couple of weeks ahead of where current is supposed to be. So that's your mild canary
Yeah, yeah.
version for your organization, and beta channel is the I want to be living on the cutting edge of this stuff.
The front, the frontier of
The forefront here.
M365. Yeah, nice.
So
It's kind of nice that Microsoft are also giving some recommendations and suggestions about where you should be. So if you are coming to this kind of, completely green and not knowing what to do,
yeah,
at least you're getting information like, guys, maybe you shouldn't be on semi-annual because, of the points that you brought up. Maybe you should look at some of the other ones. So that's
yeah.
quite nice.
And so there's two. Well, there's many ways you can slice this and control it and configure it. But the kind of two headline ones, and it depends on if you're using Intune or any other RMM for dealing with it. But under the org settings where we were for the tenant cloud services level,
Mm.
under services, if we scroll down, we should see Microsoft 365 installation options as a setting in here. And in here, you've got your three broad channel selections. You've got the current channel, the monthly enterprise, and the semi-annual. But you also have under config.office.com a dedicated dashboard for dealing with managing your M365 deployable apps. And I haven't used this in anger. This isn't my area of expertise, but from what I understand, this configuration in here can apply to any device where a user is logged in on an Entra joined machine. So that can be on-prem or hybrid or online, as long as it's, is able to kind of report back in here. So here you can see the status of your devices, where they are across what different channels. You can see in my little test environment on the screen, I've got one in current and one on monthly enterprise. And then under tenant settings, you've got specific kind of configuration that you can apply, to control the different versions that your devices are using. I think this may be something that, if anybody out there knows more about this than us, which is probably quite a few people, please, we would love to have a guest come on and kind of explain the differences between configuring this stuff through GPO, through Intune, through Config Manager, through this config.office.com site. But again, if you are an admin out there, like, come and just have a little poke around in here and see what controls and config you have configured for your organization, because it does make a difference to the end user experience overall.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And let's talk about Teams because you mentioned quite early on that maybe Teams is a little different. So what are we going to be looking at if we um, want to manage the kind of life cycle for our Teams clients?
Yeah, so Teams is like I know it's easy for us with our Teams background to say that Teams is a special use case, but Teams is a special use case because it is more tightly bound between the stuff that is happening on the service and the client that you're using on the desktop side to interact with it. So there's a lot more kind of feature flighting and things that are appearing around, like meeting controls and customizations and configuration and settings. There's a page I've got up on screen here that just shows where the Teams tap kind of maps against, those release channels. So the release channels of beta and private preview is where the tap sort of sits in that, the other diagram that we had of the like kind of the Microsoft um general experience. But the controls for Teams, it depends. So the Teams desktop client doesn't get it does get installed alongside Office if the user has a Teams license. So there's this kind of issue with the EU and the decoupling of Teams out of the kind of broader bundle. It used to be that when you installed Office, it would install Teams by default alongside it. Teams updates more rapidly than the rest of Office. So there is a specific installer that will be a machine wide installer that you can push out through your RMM or Intune or what have you. Or Teams is usually installed under the user profile, so it can update itself slightly more regularly. I think kind of Teams pushes updates out about twice a month, usually on a Monday, and then the kind of client will go through and update itself. The configuration for how you control what level of access to preview functionality a user has. This is on my screen share. I'm in admin.teams.microsoft.com, and I have the new Teams management experience. So under settings and policies, I have global and then custom. Global is it will apply to all users unless they have a custom policy. Custom is this is a policy that I'm targeting at specific groups of users. So in here, I have this Teams update management setting, and I've got kind of two settings or three settings. Only one of them really applies here. That I have show Teams preview features, and I have four settings. I can either turn that off, I can have it so that users can opt in, I can have it on for everybody. Although interestingly, I then have it is on for users in the current channel preview. So that current channel preview is referencing the Office install. So if we have set our users a group of users to be in the current channel preview Office install version, Teams will kind of match that in terms of the preview functionality that it is making available for users. And then if you have the users opt in, people in their Teams client would be able to see a setting under the three dots menu and then settings. There would be a toggle box for I want to have preview functionality. So that's kind of nice that you can target it to some users, but still give them a choice of opting in or not to have the functionality.
Yeah,
Does that make
yeah,
sense?
it feels like that public preview on and off is quite nice and maybe unique as well, a little bit to the Teams experience that you can give those users the ability to opt in, and
Yeah.
if something rolls out and they're like, I do not want this feature right now, they can just flick that switch off and
Well,
it'll
and,
go ahead.
and Microsoft is being better here about enforcing less backwards compatibility. And you might think, well, that's a bad thing from an end user point of view, but it's kind of not. It's like, you want to keep the server and the client as lockstep as possible from a version point of view, and kind of trimming out the number of back level, down level versions that Microsoft is having to support of these clients is a good thing overall for service quality and consistency. So Teams, I think when it gets to, three or so months out of date, it will hit a point where it won't let you sign in. It will force that you need to update this. So that's back to if you're doing the machine installer, there are specific things that you need to consider. Especially if you're running this in a VDI environment, I'm sure you have a bunch of customers who have Teams inside VDI. There is a very specific mechanism for making sure that VDI version is current, or as current as it can be, without putting strain on the network of everybody downloading the Teams client every morning when they log in to pull the updates for it.
Yeah. So that's covered Teams. Is there any other applications that as admins we should kind of be aware about? Maybe
I think
slightly
the only
different.
other one really would be the OneDrive for Business Sync client, right? Because that, in my mental model, is still part of the Office deployment. But that it doesn't, it's not as obviously adding new features and functionality, but that is again updated separately from the main Office applications, as far as I understand it. That will kind of sit there, it will do its thing. It's the thing that's responsible for having always make these files available offline. It's now got integrations into Windows for the right-click share experience, and you get the URLs and all that sort of stuff. So it is able to update independently of the main Office applications, but that still has the kind of the rings model as well, where you have the insider, you have production, you have deferred, but that will kind of take care of dealing with installing itself. So again, just be aware or conscious of, if OneDrive is doing something slightly weird, look at what rings your Office deployment is, so that you're kind of matching that they're lined up. Um, Other than that, you're into Windows territory, right? Like, we haven't, this isn't kind of M365 where we're going to deep dive on the Windows stuff, not at this point anyway. But, it's all very well that we've got our cloud service and we've got the Office application, but we then have Windows that we are sat on top of. And Windows is, there are less things that will change inside Windows that will have an impact on the Office stack, but it is still worth understanding that you have, Windows kind of doesn't have, for normal users, doesn't have rings in quite the same way. There is a Windows Insider program where you can be on kind of pre-release preview builds. But Windows has this now very well defined release cycle of, you have annual feature updates that come out, and then you have monthly quality updates that are the Patch Tuesday stuff. So quality updates can be security fixes, but it can also be minor improvements. And then your larger kind of feature packs, what used to be service packs, are your annual feature updates. So your controls around that are through Intune or Windows Updates or whatever else your RMM is, but it's not controlling which channel Windows is in. It's more about deferring updates for a particular amount of time. So we're like, the release comes out on June, but we're not going to install it until August. So you've got that kind of 2 month buffer to make sure there's no problems, that everything is okay. You can update some machines in the meantime before you then say, I now want everything to roll out. But if you're doing that, and that's reasonably good practice, you need to consider what you're doing about security updating, because it's all very well deferring quality of life and functionality updates, but what about security functionality? What about BIOS updates? What about the things that may pose a security risk to your organization? So we're kind of getting a little bit off to one side from our core M365 updating stack, but we were talking about this as a complicated picture. You have service side, which is your M365 stuff. You have Office apps. You have extras like Teams and OneDrive. And then you have Windows sort of sitting at the bottom of the pile of, whatever strategy you've applied to those others. You also need a strategy to apply for managing your Windows updating cycle. Clear as mud?
Very, very clear. And even on top of that, you've got the Frontier program, which
What's
is
the
something.
Frontier?
There's a great episode on the podcast for you to watch if you do want to know a little bit more about what the Copilot Frontier
Yeah.
program is. But yeah, we went through that for last month's episode. But yeah, I think that's a great kind of place to wrap up there. We've kind of gone through and you've spoke through the different life cycle updates for the different types of programs. Any particular key takeaways or something
Well,
else that we can end
the
on?
the whole bit that we haven't covered here, which is the struggle with this, is the process around how you're supposed to know what's coming when. Like, we've talked about the mechanisms of it, but it's worth just touching a tiny bit on roadmap and message center, because there is a subtle difference between those two things. That when you are in your message center, which you'll find under admin.cloud.microsoft.com again, and then down kind of under health, you'll see message center. Message center is supposed to be Microsoft notifying you about things that impact your tenant and your environment. So if you have two different tenants, you will see different sets of information inside message center, because it won't show you stuff affecting the Queues app if you don't have Teams Premium in your environment, because you're not running it. So, it shouldn't show there. But all this stuff about how release updates are pushed out and handled, that's fine. But we haven't, this is where you would find out about changes that you need to be aware of to inform your users, or stuff that is going to flow out through that updating mechanism. So something that's coming through a message center, you would see in those early preview rings or channels, so that you can then actually assess what the real impact is. But the counter to Message Center is the M365 Roadmap. So that is, if you just search for M365 Roadmap, you will see a kind of table broken down by category, showing you like all of the different things that are coming out. And unfortunately, I use the term all loosely. This, we've all had experiences, you and I, of being in tap, being on early doors for some of this stuff, and then something will hit release without it appearing on roadmap, without it going through tap. It might be a minor thing, it might be something relatively major, but this is where you're supposed to be keeping an eye and tracking. So, as an organization, make sure you are paying attention to Message Center. There is the ability in Message Center to push these out into Planner. There are other services available out there that will help you manage this in a more kind of productized fashion. And you should be paying attention to the M365 roadmap as well, to get a feel for what's coming out for Office, for Teams, for Exchange, for Copilot. Copilot did at one point have its own independent roadmap. I don't know if that has now been merged back in with the main one, but that was more sort of showing the improvements around the chatting experience, rather than kind of, hey, now it can pass images in this particular way, or what have you. So just wanted to make sure that we had touched on that as well.
Yeah, perfect. That's great. I think that's a good place to wrap up. We are, at the time of recording, currently we're going to MVP Summit next week, both of us, aren't we? So we should
Lucky
get
enough,
some
yeah.
good. Yeah, lucky enough to go. We should get some good information around these sorts of things. Roadmap, what's coming next for Microsoft products. I can guarantee there'll be a lot of Copilot mentioned while we're there for sure. But
fortunately, we don't have to play Copilot drinking bingo, because that could be unfortunate.
Yeah, I bet it could. Yeah, we're gonna be back after that with, hopefully we're gonna get some guests on to talk through some of their their key areas, and we got nothing planned, unless you've got something in the bag planned just yet.
We'll just see what comes along. We'll find something, I'm sure. Don't worry.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
It's Microsoft chucking out a new SKU, so we have to do an emergency.
Yeah. Hopefully we've not got one of them anytime soon.
Yeah, we'll see.
Right. Thanks everybody for listening, and find us on YouTube or podcast places, 365 Explained, and we'll see you next time. Cheers all.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Catch you next time. Bye.